The curse took my voice on a Tuesday. I remember the exact quality of the silence, not the silence of a room emptied of people, but the silence of something removed from you, the way a torch is lifted from a sconce, and the stone it lit goes back to being cold. One moment I was speaking. The next, the words rose in my throat and found nothing to carry them. My wolf howled inside me, a sound that stayed internal, a vibration in my chest that reached no one, and the moon seal on the great door of the marking hall glowed blue and went dark. And that was that. 11 years ago. 11 years of written orders and hand signals, and the particular exhaustion of a king who must communicate every decision through an intermediary, who watches his lords lean in to hear him, and then watches their faces change. The quick, schooled flicker of discomfort, when they remember that no sound will come. 11 years of my wolf growing quieter and quieter inside me, not gone, but tamped down, the way a fire goes to embers when there is nothing left to burn. The curse was not a mystery. My counsel had catalogued it with the thoroughness that men apply to problems they cannot solve. The false mate rite had broken the old bond seal. The seal had collapsed inward, taking my voice with it. Until the true bond was forged, the seal would remain closed. Simple enough in its logic, devastating in its application. A true bond requires a fated mate. A fated mate cannot be manufactured. And so every healer they brought me, wolf singers from the southern holds, bloodline readers from the eastern archives, a woman from the Vaelmor border who claimed the old moon language, had laid their hands on the seal scar at my throat, frowned, and admitted they could not reach it. 11 years. My hall was cold, literally cold. The great hearth fire in the main hall had gone out the night the curse fell, and though my stewards relit it every morning, it guttered to ash by midday. They stopped trying after the 3rd year. The hall was gray stone and bone-pale corridors, and the smell of old candle wax, and my wolf moved through it like a creature that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Then the village of Marin sent me a woman named Lyra. She arrived on a cart, not a carriage. I watched from the high window of the east wing, my customary post, since I could not call down to greet visitors and the walk to the main gate felt performative. A king descending in silence to stand before people who could not hear him speak. And I saw the cart roll through the gate with one horse and one woman on the bench, a worn leather pack at her feet, bundles of dried things hanging from the cart's frame. Herbs, I thought. Roots. The particular equipment of someone who works with their hands. My steward Joss had briefed me that morning in his careful way. Marin Village, he'd said, writing it on the small slate he carried for my benefit. Their healer. They say she has some knowledge of old wolf bonds. They know it is probably nothing. They send her anyway. He'd looked at me. She asked what your wolf's condition is. Not yours, his. I had looked at the slate for a long moment. No one had ever asked about my wolf first. She was not remarkable from the high window. A woman of middle years, or perhaps younger than she looked. She had the kind of face that is difficult to age, plain-featured and calm, with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being in rooms where they must not disturb things. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. Her dress was the gray-brown of someone who works outdoors and has stopped worrying about it. She looked up at the east wing as Joss met her at the gate, not at the great hall, not at the towers, but at the wing I was standing in, and for a moment I thought she had seen me. She had not, of course. She was simply orienting herself, taking the measure of a place. But my wolf lifted his head for the first time in 4 months. Not surging, not howling, just lifting, the way an old dog raises its ears at a sound it has not heard in a long time and is not yet certain is real. I noted it. I said nothing. I could say nothing, but I noted it. They put her in the East Wing workroom, which had been the herbalist's room in my grandmother's time, and still smelled of dried lavender and something sharper, mineral, that I had never been able to identify. It had a long stone table and deep window ledges that held the light in the afternoons and shelves along 2 walls that my grandmother's herbalist had filled, and that had been empty since. Within 2 hours, Lyra had unpacked her kit onto every available surface and sent Joss for 3 specific things: a clay bowl, cold water from the eastern stream rather than the cistern, and access to my wolf. The last request had caused a small crisis among my senior lords. Lord Caston, who had served my father and who treated me with the careful deference of a man who is not entirely sure the person he is deferring to is still in charge, had found me in the study and placed a note on my desk. The woman from Marin is asking to be taken to your wolf's quarters. My recommendation is that we decline. Your wolf has not allowed anyone near him in 6 weeks. The risk of injury. I had taken the note, turned it over and written on the back, "Take her." Caston had stared at the note, then at me, then at the note again. "Take her," I had written again, on a fresh line, in case the message had been unclear. He had taken her. I followed at a distance. This was not unusual. I moved through my own halls like a man who has learned to exist in the margins of his own life, present enough to govern, absent enough not to require people to manage the awkwardness of a king who cannot speak. I knew the East Corridor well. I knew which stones did not echo and which turns gave me a sightline without being in it, and I used them. My wolf's quarters were a series of rooms at the ground level of the East Wing, not a cage, nothing like that. He was still the king's wolf, and the king's wolf lived well, with deep straw and running water channeled from the eastern stream and high windows that let in cold air and gray light. But he had been increasingly unreachable. The handlers who had cared for him since he was a pup had been bitten, one by one, over the preceding months, not viciously, not with intent to injure, but with the particular blind snapping of a creature in pain who could not explain the pain. The last handler had quit in the 5th week. Since then, food was slid through the door. Lyra did not knock. She simply opened the door and walked in. I watched through the grated window in the corridor wall. My wolf was in the far corner, half standing, the muscles along his shoulders bunched with the readiness that preceded either fight or flight. He was large. The Alpha King's wolf is always large, and mine had grown massive over the years, a gray-white animal the size of a draft horse, though he moved like something lighter than that when he was well. He was not moving like that now. His movements were stiff. His left shoulder, I noticed, was held lower than his right, and had been for longer than I'd registered. He watched Lyra come in. He did not snap, he did not retreat, he watched. She did not approach him. She sat down on the floor. In the center of the room, on the cold stone, in her gray-brown dress, with her clay bowl of water, and she began to sort through the small bundles she'd carried in, pinching things between her fingers, smelling them, making a series of quiet decisions that I could not follow. She spoke the whole time, not to anyone in particular, not to him exactly, just speaking, the way some people narrate what they are doing, half to themselves and half to the room, and the room in this case contained a massive wounded wolf in a corner who had not allowed anyone within 12 feet of him in 6 weeks. She was telling him about the water, about why she'd wanted it from the eastern stream specifically, something about mineral content, about how the mountain water carried a different quality than the cistern water, about how she'd learned that from an old man in her village who treated mountain wolves and who had been very particular about the water. She was not asking permission. She was not coaxing. She was simply speaking, in the tone of someone who finds it natural to explain themselves to whatever creature shares their space. My wolf lowered his head by 2 inches. It was not much, but I had not seen him lower his head in 6 weeks, and something behind my ribs tightened in a way I could not immediately account for. She worked for 2 hours. She did not approach him for the first 40 minutes, just sat, sorted, spoke, and let the room settle. When she did begin to move closer, it was so gradual that I almost missed the increments. A foot, a pause, another foot, a pause long enough to contain a small lecture on the properties of wolf feverwort that I followed only partially. By the time she was close enough to touch him, my wolf had gone from bunched and ready to still. Not relaxed, wary, but still in the way of a creature that has decided, provisionally, that the threat level is low enough to tolerate proximity. She found the wound on his left shoulder. Old, deeper than I'd realized. Something had worked into it, a splinter of wood or a thorn, probably from weeks back when he'd been outside during one of his deteriorating episodes, and it had begun to close over the surface while the inside festered. She cleaned it. She was very matter-of-fact about it. My wolf flinched twice, and she said, each time without looking up, "I know. One more minute," and he stilled each time as if the acknowledgement were enough. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the wound critically. "This is why you've been so miserable," she said. "Not the only reason, I expect, but this didn't help." My wolf looked at her. He had very pale eyes. I had never been able to decide their exact color, something in the range of winter sky, and he held her gaze for a long moment. Then he lay down. I was gripping the window grate hard enough that the iron edge pressed into my palm, and I didn't notice until later. That night Joss brought me her report. She had written it herself, on 2 pages of good paper in a compact, practical hand, and she had addressed it to me directly, which was not the way things were typically done. The typical protocol was to report to Caston, who reported to me, but she had apparently not been informed of the typical protocol, or had been informed and found it inefficient. The report covered the wound, its treatment, its expected healing timeline, and her assessment of my wolf's general condition. Then, at the bottom of the 2nd page, "I believe the wolf's condition is connected to the bond seal condition. I don't mean this in a mystical sense. I mean that prolonged suppression of the bond signal causes physiological deterioration in both wolf and the king's body, and that the wound's failure to heal cleanly is probably connected to that suppression. I would like to continue working with him. I would also like, if possible, to be in the same room as the king at some point. Not to attempt the seal, I don't do seal work. I'm a healer, not a singer, but because proximity sometimes tells you things that notes don't. I understand if that's not possible. Lyra of Marin." I read the note twice. Then I wrote at the bottom beneath her signature, "Tomorrow morning, the East Hall study. Joss will bring you." Then I sat for a long time in the cold study with the cold hearth-fire and my wolf, who was sleeping for the first time in weeks. I could feel it, a faint warmth at the back of my sternum where his presence lived, and I tried to account for the specific quality of the feeling in my chest. I could not. I had no vocabulary for it. I had been managing absence for 11 years, and absence I understood. This was something else. Not hope exactly. I had disciplined hope out of myself some time ago, finding it less useful than practicality. Something quieter than hope. Something that simply remained. The way a coal remains warm long after the fire has stopped. She came to the East Hall study at first light. Joss brought her, stood in the doorway for a moment in the way of a man fulfilling a duty he is not entirely comfortable with, and then withdrew, because Lyra had already walked to the chair across from my desk and sat down, and was looking at me with the same direct, measuring quality with which she had looked at everything else in Vaelmor. I had a slate on the desk. I also had paper and ink for longer communications. I pushed the paper toward her and picked up the chalk. "Good morning," I wrote on the slate. "Your report was thorough." She read it. "Thank you. The wolf is better this morning. I checked before I came. Still sore, but the suppressions lifted a little. He was eating." I noted that she did not add "your wolf" or "your Majesty's wolf," just the wolf, as if he were a patient among patients. I found I preferred it. "You said proximity tells you things that notes don't. What does it tell you?" She looked at me for a moment. Not in the way people typically looked at me, which was either too careful or too studiously normal, both of which amounted to the same performance. She looked at me the way she'd looked at the wound on my wolf's shoulder, with the attention of someone who is simply trying to understand what is actually there. "That the seal is not settled," she said. "It's not locked the way a broken seal usually locks. It's still responsive. Whatever broke it 11 years ago didn't fully close the door. It just closed you off from the threshold. She tilted her head. That's unusual. Most seal breaks are permanent without a true bond repair. Yours isn't permanent, it's waiting. I looked at her. Waiting for what? She looked at her hands. I don't know yet, possibly nothing. Possibly the thing it's been waiting for has been here the whole time and the conditions haven't aligned. She looked up. I'd like to try something. It's not seal work. It's more, I have a healing song I use with wolves in suppression. It's old. My teacher's kind of old. It doesn't force anything open. It just invites. If there's nothing there to respond, nothing happens. If there is, she stopped. May I? I looked at her for a long time. Then I pushed the paper to the side, moved the slate to the edge of the desk and sat back and inclined my head. She sang quietly. That is the only way I know how to describe it. She did not perform, did not project, did not treat the song as an event. She simply began, in the way you begin a task you know well, and the song existed in the room the way the cold stone walls existed, as a property of the space rather than an imposition on it. It was not long. It was in the old language which I knew partially, and the words I caught were not dramatic words, no great invocations, no commands, no specific instructions to the universe. They were words like, hear and open and waiting and found, and once, very quietly, something that translated roughly as the one for whom the door was made. Nothing happened. I watched her face while she sang, because there was nothing else to do and because it was not unpleasant to watch. She was wholly absorbed. There was something clarifying about the quality of her focus, a particular kind of person who becomes entirely themselves when they are working. Nothing happened. The seal on my throat, that old scar, that permanent absence, sat where it had always sat, silent, and the song moved around it like water moving around stone. She stopped. She sat for a moment. Nothing, I said. And then I heard it. My own voice, in my own ears. One word, not the word I'd attempted, not the apology I'd planned for her wasted effort. The word that came out was something else entirely. A sound that had no business emerging from a man who hadn't spoken in 11 years, that shaped itself with a certainty I had not authorized. Her name. Lyra. I had not been formally introduced to her. Joss had given me her name in a briefing note 11 days ago, and I had not thought about it since. But my voice, absent for 11 years, returning to the world for the first time, chose that, and not anything else. She looked up. Her wrist was burning. I could see it from the way she looked down at it, sharp and sudden, not with pain but with surprise, and then with recognition, the way you look at something you have been told might exist but have never seen. The bond mark was rising on her inner wrist, a half circle of silver, the old shape, the one I had studied in the archives when I first began to understand what I was dealing with. My own wrist was burning. I looked at it, the same mark, mirror image. For a moment neither of us spoke. My voice was there, raw and strange after 11 years, like a limb returned to use, with the particular vulnerability of something newly restored. And I did not know what to do with it, and so I sat very still and breathed. Then Joss opened the door. He had heard it, my voice, the sound of it in the corridor, carried the impossible fact of it into the hall. And behind him was Lord Caston, and behind Caston were two of the senior lords, and behind them, gradually, more people, collecting in the corridor with the particular drawn quality of people who have heard something they cannot quite believe. I stood. My wolf somewhere in the east wing in his room lifted his voice for the first time in 11 years. Not a howl, a call, low and steady and clear. The hall went entirely quiet. I have been asked since what the first minutes were like. The assembled court, the witnesses, the lords who had managed my silence for 11 years suddenly confronted with the end of it. I do not remember the minutes in detail. I remember impressions. Caston's face, which had the expression of a man who has braced himself for so long that the removal of the thing he was bracing against is itself disorienting. Joss, who did not make a sound but whose eyes were very bright. The lords in the corridor, the handlers, the stewards, all the small population of a cold gray hall who had learned to navigate around an absence. I remember looking at Lyra. She was still sitting in the chair across from my desk in her gray-brown dress, looking at the mark on her wrist with the focused, assessing expression of a woman cataloging a new development. Not frightened, not overwhelmed, processing in the way she did everything deliberately without performance. I walked around the desk. I had the use of my voice, and I was not yet certain what to do with it. It felt exposed, that voice, like something taken out of storage, and I was not yet sure if it would hold or if it was temporary, a crack that might seal again. But I crossed the study floor, and I stood in the doorway where Joss and Caston and the assembled corridor could see me, and I did the only thing that made sense. "Her name is Lyra," I said. My voice was rough, slightly hoarse, the voice of a man who has not used it in 11 years and can feel every year of that disuse. "Of Marin, she is the king's fated mate. The bond is witnessed. She is Luna of Vaelmor." I heard someone in the corridor make a small sound. Not a protest, something more like the sound a door makes when it has been closed for a long time and is finally opened, a small releasing exhale of a sound. Lord Caston bowed. He was the first which mattered, he was the senior lord, and his bow was in the hierarchy of this hall the bow that permitted all the others. Behind him, the corridor bowed. I turned back to Lyra. She was looking at me with the same direct, measuring expression she had turned on everything in Vaelmor. "The wolf's shoulder wound needs to be dressed again in 3 days," she said. "I wrote the protocol down, but I'd prefer to do it myself if I'm staying." My voice, rusty and raw and 11 years disused, came back to me in a shape I had not expected. It sounded like relief. "You're staying," I said. She looked at the mark on her wrist again, then at mine. She tilted her head the way she had in the study when she was determining that the seal was not locked, just waiting. "I thought so," she said. The fire in the great hall lit that evening and stayed lit. Joss told me later that he hadn't done it, that the stewards hadn't done it, that no one had carried a torch to the hearthstone in the main hall. He said it simply was burning when they came in for the evening meal, as if it had decided on its own that the occasion warranted it. I did not investigate this. There are things in old wolf kingdoms that operate on their own logic, that respond to the state of the bond seal, and the state of the king in ways that the archives describe imperfectly, and that I had stopped trying to explain. I noted it, I said nothing. What I noted more, Lyra at the evening meal, at the end of the long table where Joss had placed her, not at the foot, where unfamiliar guests were typically seated, but near the head, with the quiet confidence of a man who had decided that the seating arrangement was itself a statement and had arranged it accordingly. She ate without ceremony, asked Joss 2 questions about the kitchen's herb supply that led to a 20-minute conversation. I watched from my seat with something I was not yet fully able to name. She did not glance at me repeatedly, the way new people at the high table typically glanced at me, checking my reaction, calibrating theirs. She was simply there, occupying the space with the same settled quality she occupied every space. My wolf was calm that night, truly calm in the deep settled way he had not been calm in years. I could feel it, the warmth of it at the back of my chest. Not the thin embers I'd grown accustomed to, but something that burned steadily, that had found its air. After the meal, I went to the East Wing workroom. She was there, reordering her supplies on the shelves along the wall, the shelves that had been empty since my grandmother's herbalist had gone, with the same methodical focus. She had already filled 3 shelves. The room smelled of dried herbs and cold water from the eastern stream, and something underneath all of that. Warmth. A particular quality of warmth, the kind that a room acquires when someone who knows how to be still inhabits it. She heard me at the door and turned. I leaned against the door frame. My voice was still new and slightly strange in my own ears, and I was still learning how to trust it, how to commit to the sound of my own words in a way I had not done for 11 years. "When you wrote in your report," I said, "that you wanted to be in the same room as me, what did you think you would find?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "I wasn't sure," she said. "Sometimes with a bond suppression specifically, what you're actually treating is loneliness, not sadness, a different thing, the state of being a creature that is made for connection and is being denied it." She looked at the mark on her wrist, turning it slightly in the candlelight. "I thought I'd find that. I found more." "More," I said. "The seal was waiting," she said. "You were waiting. Your wolf was waiting." She looked up at me, direct and steady. 11 years is a long time to wait." "Yes," I said. The word came out simply, without performance, without the guard I'd kept up for 11 years. Just, yes, an acknowledgement. 11 years is a long time. She had named it accurately, without fanfare, and it required nothing more. She returned to the shelves. I stayed in the doorframe for a moment, watching the room fill with the small, ordered life of a woman who had already decided, in her practical, undemonstrative way, that she was going to make this space hers. "The Eastern Stream water," I said. "The old man who taught you about it, the one who treated mountain wolves." She smiled without turning around. "You were listening." "I was watching. I couldn't hear you from where I was standing." She turned at that and looked at me with a curiosity that was warm. "The grated window in the corridor." "Yes." "I thought someone was there." She turned back to the shelf. "I didn't know it was you." "Would it have changed anything?" She considered this with genuine attention, sorting 2 small bundles of dried herb. "No," she said. I stood in the doorway of the workroom while the candles burned, and the fire in the great hall sent warmth through the stone of the east wing for the first time in 11 years, and I found, for the first time in 11 years, that there was nowhere I needed to be but here, watching this woman fill the empty shelves of the room that had been waiting for someone to fill them. It took 3 days for my voice to fully settle, not to return, it had returned, but to stop feeling like a borrowed thing and start feeling like mine again. 11 years is a significant absence. The first morning I had woken and spoken a word before I was fully awake, just to be certain, just to confirm. Yes, still there, still real. Lyra had, by the 3rd morning, reorganized the East Wing workroom to her satisfaction, established a working relationship with the kitchen staff that had already yielded what Joss described to me, with faint bewilderment, as the best broth this kitchen has produced in living memory, and spent 2 hours with my wolf each morning and evening. He was visibly better. The stiffness was leaving his shoulder. He had begun to meet her at the door. She and I fell into a rhythm that surprised me with how natural it felt. Morning, the East Hall study where I had previously spent my mornings writing orders in silence. She now joined me and we talked. This was the simple, stunning fact of it, that there was someone in the room with me, and we simply talked about the hall, about Vaelmor's history, about the wolf bond and what she knew of it from the old records she'd found on the workroom shelves. She read the old text the way she read wounds, directly, without mysticism, looking for what was actually there. Afternoon, she worked. I governed, or did the approximation of governing that is possible when you are also profoundly distracted. Evening, the workroom, or the frost garden, which she had discovered in the 2nd week and which she seemed to find useful. The frost garden was the hall's east side walled garden, planted by one of my ancestors with the cold weather plants of the northern holds, winter bloom gray sage, the pale vines called ice flowers that bloomed only in frost. It had been maintained through the years of the curse more out of habit than purpose. Lyra walked through it in the evenings and told me what she found there with a specificity that suggested she was, in some practical way, already beginning to think of it as a working garden. What she could use, what she'd add, what the light conditions meant for the winter bloom's production if it was pruned before the hard frost came. I walked beside her. My voice was returned and I used it, still with the slight roughness of 11 years of disuse, and she listened in the focused way she listened to everything. And sometimes she asked questions, and sometimes she didn't. And the frost garden in the evening was quiet and cold and smelled of the gray sage and the ice flowers, and I found I did not want to be anywhere else. The bond mark on my wrist had settled to a pale silver, the old color, the proper color. Hers matched. Lord Caston came to me in the 4th week with a formal petition from the senior lords for a proper bond ceremony, a public ratification, a court occasion. He was careful and correct in the way he always was, and I could see that he expected me to defer it, to manage the matter with the same careful distance I had managed everything for 11 years. "Set the date," I said. He blinked. The blinking was brief and quickly controlled. "Of course," he said, "and the Luna's preferences regarding." "Ask her," I said. "She'll have views." She did have views. The ceremony, as Lyra designed it with Joss's assistance and Caston's barely concealed astonishment, was brief, practical, and entirely dignified. No grand procession. No lengthy recitation of lineages, in which I would have had to stand at the front of my hall listening to genealogists enumerate the absence of hers. A bond witnessing in the marking hall before the assembled court, the mark shown, the names given, the Luna named. Complete in 20 minutes. Afterwards, Lyra had arranged for the kitchen to produce an actual celebratory meal, which the hall had apparently not had in 11 years either. I stood in the marking hall while Joss read the witnessing, and I looked at Lyra across the carved surface of the old bond table and felt, with a clarity that had not been available to me for 11 years, that the word waiting was over. She looked back at me with her direct, steady gaze and the faintest suggestion of a smile. The stone wolf in the frost garden, old, gray, carved by some ancestor as a ward figure, had a collar of ice. It was a permanent thing, that collar, the moisture in the cold northern air freezing in the recesses of the carved stone, year-round. I had looked at it from the east wing window for 11 years, a gray figure in a gray garden, the ice at its throat as constant as the silence in mine. On the morning of the first day of spring, the northern spring, which in Vaelmor amounts to a marginal reduction in the daily cold, I walked through the frost garden with Lyra in the early light, and I looked at the stone wolf, and I saw that the ice at its collar had melted. Not the stone, not the wolf, just the ice gone, the gray stone of the collar exposed for the first time, a warm reddish-gray under the winter pale, the first morning of warmth. Lyra looked at it. "You've been watching that for 11 years, she said, not a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The frost garden was still and cold, and the ice flowers on the east wall were beginning to think about blooming. "It's a nice stone wolf," she said eventually. I looked at her. "It is," I said. She slipped her hand into mine, simply, without ceremony, the way she did everything, and we stood in the first light of the first warm morning, and the stone wolf stood above its melted collar, and my wolf, inside me, was warm and steady and quiet, the quiet of a creature that has come home. She had not saved me with a great act. She had not broken the seal with power or bloodline or ancient knowledge. She had sat on the floor of a cold room and spoken to a wounded wolf in a tone that assumed his intelligence, and she had sung an ordinary song in the old language, and the door that had been waiting had simply opened to the one for whom it was made. That was all, that was everything. I held her hand in the frost garden in the first warmth of the year, and I did not think about the 11 years because there was no particular use in thinking about them anymore. They were the waiting, and the waiting was done.